Welcome to Chapter 11, The Red Horizon. Elias sat in the sterile white room, the contract in front of him. The Mars colonization project was calling for volunteers, pioneers, willing to leave everything behind for the sake of human progress. A one-way ticket, no return, no second chances. For most, the idea was unthinkable. For Elias, it was an escape. The voices had grown louder, the whispers no longer confined to the edges of his mind. The world had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows and conspiracies, each one twisting around him. But Mars was untouched, silent, empty. His hands trembled as he signed the paper. 3 months later, he stood inside the Odyssey, the spacecraft that would carry him and a handful of others across the void. As the engines roared, a final thought struck him. What if I'm not escaping my mind? What if I'm bringing it with me? The journey was 6 months of solitude. The others kept their distance. They whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. He barely speaks. Do you think he'll make it? They should have screened him better. Elias spent most of his time staring out into the abyss of space, the vast nothingness, a reflection of his own mind. And then they landed. Mars was everything and nothing. The endless red sand stretched before him, and for the first time he felt peace. No crowds, no distractions, just silence. But soon the silence started speaking back. At night he heard footsteps outside the colony, heavy, unmistakable. When he told the others, they laughed. Mars is empty, Elias. But he knew better. Something was watching. Something was waiting. And one night he stepped outside, alone, into the cold, suffocating air. He walked until the colony's lights disappeared behind him, until he was nothing but a small figure against an endless red horizon. And then the shadow moved. Chapter 11. A Second Chance Among the Stars. Elias never imagined he'd be considered for something like this. The Mars colonization project had been a distant dream, a mission for younger, healthier minds. But somehow he had passed. He wasn't just being sent to Mars, he was needed there. The thought filled him with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. The training was rigorous, months of preparation, psychological evaluations, teamwork exercises. This wasn't just about survival, it was about thriving in a new world. The doctors were aware of his struggles, but they didn't dismiss him. Instead, they taught him techniques to manage his thoughts, to ground himself. Your mind will come with you, one of them told him, but so will everything you learn to control it. 6 months in space felt like meditation. The quiet hum of the ship, the slow drift of time. He bonded with his crewmates, sharing stories, laughter, and the quiet awe of seeing Earth shrink into a distant blue dot. And then they arrived. Mars was breathtaking. The endless crimson dunes, the sky dusted with pink and orange. It felt like standing on the edge of a new beginning. He found joy in the routine, constructing the colony, exploring the surface, conducting research. He felt his mind clear, the static of the past fears fading. One evening, as he stood watching the first sunrise on Mars, a fellow astronaut, Sophia, stood beside him. "We're the first," she whispered. "Everything we do here will be remembered forever." For the first time in a long time, Elias smiled. Maybe this was here. This was where he was meant to be. Maybe for the first time, he was truly free. Chapter 12. The Red Mirage. Elias had begun to settle into life on Mars. The daily routine kept his mind occupied, constructing habitats, collecting soil samples, monitoring oxygen levels. The silence of the red planet was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once consumed his thoughts back on Earth. Then one night, everything changed. He woke up to the sound of static. The communication panel in his quarters flickered with distorted images. Grainy, glitching, wrong! He leaned closer, heart pounding. The screen showed Earth, but it wasn't the planet he remembered. The oceans were black, the land cracked and burning. Then came the voice, faint, familiar. "Elias, don't trust them." His breath hitched. The voice was his own. The screen snapped off. The room plunged into darkness. He stumbled out into the Martian night, his suit sealing shut with a hiss. The others were asleep. The colony was silent, but in the distance, beyond the safety perimeter, a figure stood against the blood-red dunes. It was himself. The duplicate raised a glove and pointed toward the colony. "They're lying to you." Elias turned, and for the first time, he saw it. The buildings wrong, twisted, the walls breathing, the pulse, the sky pulsing like a living thing. Had it always been like this? Had he been blind until now? A violent shudder rippled through his skull, and suddenly he was back in his quarters, gasping for air, as if waking from a nightmare. But outside, in the red sands, footprints led away from the colony. And they weren't his. Chapter 12. A Test of Strength. Elias had started to believe that Mars was his fresh start. Every sunrise on the horizon felt like a new beginning. Every task a step toward building something greater. He had a purpose. He had peace. Until the explosion. It happened just before dawn. The entire habitat shook as a deafening boom echoed through the valley. Elias was thrown from his bunk, alarms blaring in his ears. Emergency lights bathed everything in a harsh red glow. "This is Sophia. Station 4 is down. Repeat, we have a breach." Elias scrambled to his feet, pulling on his suit. He ran toward the control panel, fingers shaking as he scanned the damage report. The oxygen farm. Critical failure. Without the farm, they had days, maybe less. The team rushed outside, their boots sinking into the crimson dust. The greenhouse structure lay in ruins, shattered glass and torn insulation scattered across the landscape. "Meteor strike?" someone asked. Elias knelt, brushing away dust from the impact site. No crater, no entry point. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was sabotage. His blood ran cold. "We are not alone here," Sophia whispered, and for the first time since arriving, Elias felt something he thought he had left behind on Earth. Fear. Chapter 13. The Path Home. The Desperate Escape. Elias had always known that Mars was a one-way journey. That was the reality they had all accepted when they left Earth behind. No return, no rescue. But now, as the days passed after the explosion, the whispers in his mind twisted into something more sinister. He was sure that something was watching them, manipulating their fate. The footprints in the sand, the flickering messages on the screen, the other him, they weren't hallucinations. They couldn't be. And if Mars wanted him to stay, then he had only one choice. He had to leave. Unraveling the mystery. Elias spent days analyzing the explosion, scanning logs, cross-referencing every detail. If someone had sabotaged the oxygen farm, who or what was behind it? Then he found it, a distorted signal, buried deep within the habitat's data logs. It wasn't human-made. It was coming from somewhere beneath the surface. "We need to go underground," he told Sophia. She hesitated. "Elias, we don't know what's down there." "That's exactly why we need to find out." The descent. Armed with flashlights and oxygen reserves, Elias and Sophia ventured into an old lava tube near the colony, one of the countless caves that stretched beneath the Martian surface. As they descended, the signal grew stronger, the air felt thicker, charged with energy Elias couldn't explain. Then they saw it, a vessel buried under centuries of dust. It was not human-made. Sophia gasped. "Elias, this is why we were brought here." Inside, they found technology far beyond their understanding. But one thing was clear. This ship was built for travel, fast travel, maybe even back to Earth. The whispers in Elias' mind shifted. They weren't voices of fear anymore. They were instructions, and he was ready to listen. Chapter 13. A Hopeful Return. The destruction of the oxygen farm had shaken the entire colony, but Elias refused to let it break him. They had come here to build a future, not to let fear decide their fate. "We're not alone here," Sophia had said, and she was right. But if someone or something had tried to sabotage them, it meant that there was something worth protecting. Solving the crisis. Elias threw himself into his work, analyzing the damage, piecing together every fragment of data. If they couldn't repair the farm, they needed another way to generate oxygen, fast. Then it hit him. "Algae," he said out loud. "The backup storage, if we modified the reactors to accelerate growth." Sophia's eyes widened. "We could rebuild the oxygen system within weeks." Together, they rallied the crew. They weren't letting Mars win. The call home. But Elias wasn't satisfied with just fixing the oxygen problem. He knew that they had to return to Earth, not as failures, but as survivors. Using the deep space radio, he worked tirelessly to boost the colony's distress beacon. It had always been a long shot. NASA had told them that no rescue missions were possible, but Elias refused to believe that. And one night, after weeks of silence, the screen flickered to life. A voice crackled through the static. This is Mission Control. We received your signal. Stand by. Elias exhaled sharply. They were coming home. Chapter 14. The Journey Back. A return, but not the same. The alien vessel, silent, ancient, waiting, was their only chance. Elias stood at the control panel, his fingers hovering over the symbols he didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. The ship wanted him to leave. It had been calling to him long before the explosion, whispering in his mind, planting thoughts he once dismissed as delusions. But he knew the truth. This wasn't just a way to get home. This was a test. What if this isn't safe? Sophia asked, her voice tense. Nothing on Mars is safe, Elias answered, activating the controls. With a deep, resonant hum, the ship came to life. The departure. The others refused to join them. Fear held them back. We're not meant to leave, someone whispered. This isn't a ship, it's a tomb, others said. But Elias and Sophia boarded anyway. They had come too far to turn back now. The interior was eerie, yet familiar, as if built by minds who understood human instinct, but had never been human themselves. As they strapped in, the ship's walls pulsed softly, responding to Elias' presence. The countdown began, though no numbers appeared, only a feeling deep in his mind. 3, 2, 1, and then Mars was gone. The arrival. The journey felt like an eternity and a single heartbeat, all at once. Colors bled together, shapes twisted. There was no up, no down. Only the sense of moving through something vast and alive. Then impact. Earth's atmosphere roared under them, around them. Fire streaking past the windows. The ship adjusted automatically, calculating descent vectors no human mind could process. And then silence. They had landed. Elias unbuckled himself and staggered outside, his breath catching in his throat. This was Earth, wasn't it? The trees looked wrong, the sky darker than he remembered, the air felt thicker, and then he saw them. Figures in the distance, watching, their silhouettes almost human. Sophia, his voice was barely a whisper. She turned and her eyes widened in horror, because the figures were moving closer, and they had no faces. Chapter 14. A triumphant return. The deep space radio crackled again. Elias, confirm your status. We're preparing for re-entry guidance. He almost couldn't believe it. They were really going home. The entire colony gathered to watch as the rescue vessel arrived, descending onto the dusty Martian surface like a beacon of hope. A decade ago, a return mission had been impossible, but Elias and his team had proven survival was possible. Their perseverance had forced NASA to act. Now Earth was waiting for them. The final steps on Mars. Elias stood outside the colony for one last time, gazing at the barren red horizon. You ready? Sophia asked. He nodded. This planet had tested him, broken him, shaped him, but it was time to leave it behind. One by one, they boarded the spacecraft, strapping in as the engines roared to life. The ground trembled beneath them. Engine stable, trajectory locked, initiating launch in 3, 2, 1. The force of acceleration pressed them into their seats as the red world fell away beneath them. Mars, once their prison, was now nothing more than a distant memory. They were free. The return to Earth. The journey home was filled with anxious excitement. What would Earth be like after all these years? Would it feel foreign? Would it still belong? The moment the ship entered the Earth's atmosphere, the entire crew cheered. And when they touched down, stepping onto solid ground for the first time in years, Elias felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The sky stretched endless above him, the scent of rain and soil filling his lungs. Sophia laughed beside him, tears in her eyes. "We made it," she whispered. Elias smiled. "Yeah, we did." 2 journeys, 2 destinies. One, Elias had returned to the world that was no longer his own. The other, Elias had found his way home. But in both versions, one truth remained. Mars had changed him, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 15. The Truth Unraveling. A Fractured Reality. Elias had thought coming back to Earth would bring clarity, that stepping onto familiar soil would anchor him in reality again. But reality had become slippery. At first it was subtle, the way people hesitated before answering him, the strange glances Sophia gave when she thought he wasn't looking, the way his reflection in the mirror sometimes lagged behind his movements. But then he saw Johannes. The impossible encounter. Johannes was standing outside Elias' recovery unit, his expression unreadable. "Johannes?" Elias whispered, his voice cracking. Johannes tilted his head slightly, stepping forward. His presence was so solid, so real, Elias felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I knew you made it. I knew you were real." Johannes' expression didn't change. "Elias," he said, "it is time to wake up." The collapse. Something inside Elias shattered. Memories came rushing back. Memories that didn't make sense. Moments from Mars that blurred. Conversations that looped. Time that bent in impossible ways. He gasped as flashes of another perspective flooded his mind. A medical room, machines humming, doctors whispering. Sophia speaking softly to someone, but not to him. His own voice recorded in logs, but distorted, fragmented. And then the truth clicked into place. Johannes had never been the hallucination. Elias was. He staggered backward, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. No, that's not right. I lived this. I survived Mars. I came home. But had he? The walls around him flickered, and suddenly he was back on Mars, alone. The ship had never worked. The rescue mission had never come. And Elias had never left. Chapter 15. A New Understanding. Elias sat in his small apartment, staring at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from weight of understanding. The trip home, the celebration, the joy of stepping back onto earth. It had felt too perfect. And now he knew why. Johannes appeared beside him, sitting on the couch like he had done so many times before on Mars. His expression was calm, expectant. "You figured it out, haven't you?" Johannes said. Elias swallowed. "You're real, aren't you?" Johannes gave a smile, sad smile. "I am, but you're not." Elias exhaled shakingly, leaning back. The pieces clicked together with a terrifying clarity. Johannes had survived. Elias had not. Accepting the truth. His mind had done what it could to protect him, to give him a story where he had made it home. But that wasn't what really had happened. The oxygen failure, the desperate fight for survival. Elias had died on Mars, but instead of vanishing, his consciousness, his mind had clung on. A memory that refused to let go. "What happens now?" Elias asked, his voice quieter now. "That's up to you," Johannes said. "You can fight it, stay here as a shadow of something that once was, or..." Elias closed his eyes. He could hear distant voices, muffled yet familiar. The other colonists, the mission logs, the last transmissions before everything went dark. Johannes placed a hand on his shoulder. "It is time to rest." Elias opened his eyes and smiled softly. "I think I'm ready." And then, like the dust of Mars in the wind, he faded. Two realities, one ending. In one world, Elias remained trapped in an illusion of escape. In another, he found peace. But in both, the truth remained the same. Elias had never truly left Mars.